Sector.
And I'm Linda's Ice Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Arcane Mark.
Welcome to the show. Today, we are going to be talking about how skills secretly shape a tabletop RPG. Now, we have a D20 on the sort of thumbnail, but this is not only for D20 games. How proficiency can shift and change the way that the game plays, and a whole bunch of other things like that.
So to start off, let's talk about what is a skill as opposed to, say, an ability that you get from a class or something like that.
So the answer to that question is just part of how skills secretly shape the game. I also do want to point out that today, when this is live, the Year of Titans Kickstarter has just come out. Titans.rollforcombat.com. You can check it out. It has come out literally today. So, in a tabletop RPG, Linda's question is a subset of a bigger question, which is, what do you choose to make into skills in your tabletop RPG?
Well, what is a skill, though?
Well, no, but what do you choose to make into skills? That determines what a skill is. You don't know what the skill is until you decide what you chose to make into skills. So, a skill in general can mean one thing in one game and something else in another game. When we are talking about skills in particular here, we mean something that basically your character can become better at, or maybe in some games they can't, but they can at least learn how to use them. They may have some proficiency progression or have a flat progression that doesn't increase.
Would you consider a skill to inherently be something that's separate from that's something that you can choose as you go along, or that
not
might be
necessarily?
customizable in some
No,
way?
in some games they are static.
So what is it that makes us? What does the word skill mean then?
Well, we're going to get into that,
Yeah.
Linda. So your game is secretly shaped by what was chosen to be a skill in the game, in the sense of some kind of ability that you can get better at. Usually a skill is going to be related to some kind of capacity or proficiency that you have. Something like something like crafting could be a skill, or athletics, or maybe just jumping on its own can be a skill. But the reason that these secretly shape your game is we have to decide what is going to be a skill in this game. What categories of skills are they? How are they organized? Are some of them privileged categories of skills that act differently than other skills? Are there something in your game that are not called skills, even though they advance kind of like skills do, but they just cannot be selected or chosen alongside the things that are called skills in your game?
Do you pull together things that are used for combat efficacy and out of combat abilities into the same bucket, or are they separated in some way?
Exactly. And what you do with that decision is going to have a huge effect on your entire game and
One of
how
the
it
other
plays.
things with skills too is how big you make the buckets makes a huge difference in how the game is going to play. You know, if you have very narrow and focused categories, that's going to not only it gives a message to the GM, hey, you know, this is something that's very important for this particular game. Or, you know,
or at least it should give that message.
It should give that message.
In
and
some
if it doesn't,
in some
then
games,
it's an issue.
in some games it doesn't. Some games made decisions entirely based off of simulation or appeasing people who were like, well, wait a minute, being better at a violin does not make you better at singing or a trumpet. Not really. Not past a certain point where you know the basics of music. And so in, D&D 3rd edition, you needed to get a separate performance skill for each of those types of music. And that was a decision that was made that did break things out into a large number of sub-buckets, while the game itself did not go along with making performance into a huge part of your game, even though it could cost a huge number of your resources. As a result, it led to a gameplay loop where if you got a performance at all, it would generally just be one. And if you required a very specific kind of performance in a written adventure, probably nobody would have it.
Yeah. Well, I imagine that's part of what shaped the way that lores are handled in Pathfinder Second Edition, where they're more specific, but also there's a lot of different ways to get one while getting other things.
And they had a slightly lower cost than other skills did. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so, in some games, the section that we would call skills, even if that game calls them something else, like talents or abilities, includes not only sort of traditional like skills in the D&D and Pathfinder sense that are mostly out of combat, but do, like you said, Linda, include combat skills like melee or ranged as a skill. Or
is there a skill that determines how much damage that you deal? Is there a skill that determines how good you are at defending yourself?
Exactly. Things that are the core capacity of your character in combat. So a game that is putting all of those things together without a privileged buckets where you say, okay, well, but you can only spend a certain amount on this type, or they cost more for that type, or that type advances statically based on your progression and not in the same way as the others. Whenever that is being done, the game is sending a sort of subconscious signal that they want you to think that being good at combat in that game is no more special than anything else. Now, not every game that sends that signal delivers on it, just like separated out, but it wasn't a virtuoso's delight of a tabletop RPG where music was important. You do sometimes have games where, yes, actually the combat skills are still way more important if you ever going to get into a fight, but since they are not privileged, they're in there with all the other skills, then like a lot of people are going to heavily focus them, or at least make sure they're good enough at the essential ones, and then some people won't and will get wrecked.
Yeah. Generally, though, you're going to see with skills a simplification that assumes that groups ability at a wide variety of things into a small number of buckets. So, if you have a skill that is about knowing about history and society and all these kinds of things, then, the person who's good at that skill might be assumed to be equally good at knowing about the history of every period and every era. Or, so
and
there's
if you have a
skill,
game where there's a skill that is medieval versus like Renaissance history are different skills, then this is a game, which should be at least, a game that is about history. And where history is just such an important part of the game that you need to separate out those skills, and they are considered valuable. In theory, if a game makes skills equally valuable and equally difficult to obtain, and all in the same bucket, they should be like roughly equally useful. Obviously, there are going to be some that are a little bit less useful, but they might be perfect for your character, and some that are a little bit more useful.
Yeah, and it may also be something that depends upon the campaign, too. So if you have a skill that's all about surviving in the wilderness, and your campaign is a completely urban campaign, maybe that's not going to be as useful in that game.
That's right. And so all of these little decisions you make with skills will make major ripple effects down the line, like we talked about, where combat skills are just thrown in there. And there's a lot of tabletop RPGs where that's the case. But in some of them, they live up to that by making it so all the skills could be used equally in combat for whatever you want to do with them. Or where the skills just kind of cover a pretty even amount of the situations in the game, like in Blades in the Dark, where the different types of moves you want to make. Yeah, sure, there's one that kind of is used for ranged attacks and one that's kind of used for melee attacks, but those are not the only ways that you handle things.
And if you have a system where it's like you could be good at ranged attacks, you could be good at melee attacks, or you could be good at like spell power, which doesn't really use either of those types of things in some way, then you don't have to invest in certain skills.
The other thing about that system is that whoever is going to make the move makes the move, so you don't need to be good at melee attacks if somebody is good at melee attacks. You might not need to be good at any attacks because you just don't have to make the move when attacking is the right thing. You can wait for your time in Blades in the Dark.
Yeah.
Whereas in, say, World of Darkness, if your character is not good at any kind of melee, brawling, range attack like firearms, or sometimes they have archery depending on which one you're playing, or any kind of special magic or ability for whatever type of creature or being you are at fighting. And everything that you have is investigative or social skills.
You're going to have some trouble.
If you get into a fight, your character is not going to be able to do much. You might still win because the combat person is so busted in combat that they sort of carry you, but it could get really dicey for you in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Another consideration is how many buckets there are compared to how many buckets a given character can access. Because if you have a game where a lot of characters are going to have over half of the skills, then you're going to expect a lot of overlap in the kinds of things that people can do. Whereas if you have a game where characters have relatively few of the skills,
you have
overall,
50 skills and most characters have like 6 of them.
Yeah, then adventures for that system aren't going to be written to assume that you have any one specific skill. And stories are going to need to expect, okay, these skills are not things that we assume that the whole group has covered. These skills are examples of ways that people might approach a problem.
And Math Guy Dave sent a super chat. Good luck with the Year of Titans. Thanks, you, Math Guy Dave. He's heading off to his 7 Dooms game. So you're absolutely right about that, Linda. And so it's not just how many skills you get, but how you can pick from your skills. So, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition or D&D 5e, you can kind of just pick the ones that you want to pick. But there's some games where, depending on what type of character you are, you're limited in what type of skills you can take. Even like 3rd edition D&D had cross-class skills that you would not advance at the same rate in those cross-class skills.
Or are skills an automatic part of a broader package like a class that are granted, and then you have certain ones that you can't access at all?
That's right. A lot of OSR games, or even just older editions of D&D, the skills were kind of just like a class feature of certain classes, and only those classes had those skills, and nobody else could do it. Or if they did, they just have to kind of convince the GM that they were able to do that thing. So there's all sorts of ways to put skills in the game, and each little decision you make makes a big effect on not only the players' sort of play habits and just sort of what winds up becoming the metagame of your game, but also just sort of like the feel of the game. Here's another one that sort of will move us towards the proficiency part of this episode, which is, how do you progress your skills? Is it a smooth progression where there's some kind of skill point resource and you can just spend them in, and it costs the same amount each time, and there's no limit based on your level? So it's like, hey, do you want to be maxed out in this one skill at first level instead of having more skills that you're weaker than? Sure. Or maybe there's just at character creation, you can't go beyond point X.
Yeah.
Which you can see in like Blades in the Dark or World of Darkness. But then afterwards, it's the Wild West. In some cases, the idea might be that there's a strict level limit to when you can raise each time. That is true in the Cosmere RPG, at least in the beta version that has been seen, as well as Pathfinder 2nd Edition, where you can't get to Expert until 2nd level, until Master until 7th, and Legendary until 15th. Or it might cost more to get to the higher points in the skill. World of Darkness, again, you pay more experience as you keep getting better and better at the skill to continue to advance it.
And together with cost and accessibility, as you've been discussing here, another very key feature is when you have these different bands of how good you can be at a skill, which we're referring to as proficiencies here, what is the fundamental difference between these different levels of ability?
What does it actually mean?
What does it actually mean? Are there certain things that are gated that you need to have a certain level of ability in it to do? Is it, what is your chance of succeeding at basic tasks if you're very good at a skill versus if you don't have it at all? Are there certain things you can't do at all if you're not if you don't have the skill, or certain things that require you to be like level 2 with the skill before you can do? Since that's gonna, or can everybody, because everybody can attempt anything, and then you're only a tiny bit better for having the skill, then it's more of like, okay, everyone is versatile, but this person's a little better versus you really need this one person to do this kind of thing at all.
So if you can go all in into the skills that you have and just max them out, so-called min-maxing, having maximum in your best things and minimum in the things you don't care about, that's usually the strongest option. Some games come up with a counterbalance to help go against that. For instance, as we mentioned before, Blades in the Dark, since you could just let other people do the moves a lot of the time if it's something you're really bad at, it would be even more important to min-max than it might be in games where, well, this character is going to be the one who has to do thing X. Except that all of the defenses that are going to keep you out of trouble, that allow you to try to like shrug off some problematic stuff and consequences that are happening to you, are based, their pull, it's almost like a separate sideways defensive skill that is built by seeing how many of the skills at each category you have at least one in.
Yes.
And so that is a sort of a thing that gives you a carrot for going wide instead of charging you more or making it more difficult to go deep on a single skill. And so that is just another example of something that you can do when you are working with your skills to sort of subtly, or maybe even not so subtly, encourage players and their characters to grow in certain ways that match the stories that you want to tell in your tabletop RPG.
And so you mentioned of talent trees as well, skills that are predicated upon other skills.
Yes.
In some way.
You can definitely have skills that are like that. Rohit points out some games have backgrounds as skills, or have no skills, but you can kind of just declare your background to try to do things. And he pointed out 13th Age is something that has that, although players sometimes use sophistry to connect everything to their background. I know that when I was playing Shadow Dark, I always tried to connect things that were going on to my cleric's herbalist background, because there were drugs and other things. I was like, can I like find a way to heal this thing that was happening from this drug by using my herbalist background? So I just tried to make an excuse to use my herbalist background for everything, because there are no skills. In that game, everything is done based on your character's attributes. And so basically, you're kind of shaping the discourse between the GM and the player as the game designer when you're deciding how these skills are going to be.
And that's another thing that you're implying, another important point here too, which is that when you're shaping the skills, it really matters how tightly or broadly defined they are in terms of what they can do. Does the skill say, this is the skill that is about swimming, it can only be used to swim? Here's a chart that says how difficult it is to swim in different types of water, and this is what you use swim for.
Or does your game have a swim skill that says, it's used with alongside, your strength to swim through water, but you can also swim through complex social currents with swim and charisma, because it's the same swimming skills somehow that make you good at both of these things.
Yeah, well, swim's like a very specific skill, but does it have does your game have like a socialized skill that could cover like anything that has to do with like talking or convincing people, however you do it? So depending on how specific it is, it's also going to help the GM figure out how they want to do it. And generally, the more tightly defined things can be easier to pick up and use, but the broader ones can be more flexible for tables that are like, yeah, sure, why not?
That's right. So the trick with proficiency increases, not just talking about whether they cost more or when they can occur, is that your decision of how to increase proficiency and how much will influence the stories that you're able to tell in your tabletop RPG. Now, if proficiency in a skill, by which I mean in this case your numerical capacity to succeed at more challenging tasks with that skill more reliably, if that never increases, maybe you have a game where you either can't use the skill or you can, and when you can, you never get better at it. And that could be a tabletop RPG that exists, but that game doesn't really have a sense of progression in that case, other than the progression of gaining new skills that you can attempt. Your chances will always be the same as they were. Maybe circumstances of the battlefield, like flanking, are the ways to get better chances on what you're doing, and you just never get it from character progression. Maybe it's less about a long-term campaign and more about a sort of episode where you're not meant to play that character again later, so you don't need a progression. But in most cases, there will be at least some progression, even if it's a lighter progression. Like, for instance, the bounded accuracy of 5e D&D isn't, like, completely bounded. You know, once you get the proficiency at 2, it does go up to 3, 4, 5, and 6. It might even be doubled in some cases for some characters. And that is not as high as the amount that proficiency modifiers can be in Pathfinder 2, where if you are a legendary 20th level character, you can have 28, not even getting into Mythic.
And there's also the matter of what are the bounds on what a skill can achieve. Is the skill limited by what is possible in real life? Or is the skill allow characters who are profoundly superhuman?
That's true. And so how you allow the advancement will determine that question. It will also determine how your characters in your stories square up compared to themselves in the past, their enemies in the past, and larger groups of weaker enemies or smaller groups of more powerful enemies.
Yeah, and it also determines what can be done with skills versus what is only in the realm of magic or technology or those kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Which is very important.
Yes. So if you have a system with very little progression in terms of your probability increase with skills, then in that system, you will find that large groups of weaker enemies are a little bit more threatening because your skills, and in this case some of your combat skills, which may or may not have the same progression as out of combat skills, did not advance by enough in terms of your percent chance of succeeding or to stopping them from succeeding to make up for the action economy of the enemies. In the same way, if you progress quickly, that means that those weaker enemies in large groups are easier to deal with, but smaller groups of high-level enemies are
going to be much tougher.
Going to be tougher. They won't be a cakewalk if you have any significant progression. And progression doesn't have to mean a larger bonus against a certain difficulty, rolling some number of dice and adding that bonus. That is a type of progression that not only raises your probability of achieving the same thing, but also, like Linda said, allows you to achieve a number that was higher than you ever could have possibly achieved before. There are other forms of progression than that. For instance, in Blades in the Dark, you can always get a 6. Even if you're complete trash and you don't even have the skill, you can roll 2d6 twice, get 6s on both of them, 1 in 36 times that'll happen, and get a 6, which will be a total success without a drawback. So it could be about
your probability of being successful rather than how high your success
When you progress in systems like that, your probability is going up, which it is when your modifier goes up in a D20 system, but your maximum capacity for what you can do is never increasing. Well, technically, I guess in Blades in the Dark, when you go from 0 dice to 1 dice to 2 dice, then you're capable of getting a critical success. So it increases 1 time at the very low stages, and also there are ways to get more dice added on, so it evens out. But mostly, the maximum of what you can do never increases, but instead your chance of consistently doing better goes up.
Or there's a mention of one of the skill feats in Pathfinder 2nd Edition in chat of is being able to unlock more usages in a flexible way. It doesn't have to be tied specifically to, hey, if the skill reaches this point, then you can do this. It could be, okay, I'm going to unlock different upgrades.
Yes, your upgrades aren't always going to be mathematical, probabilistic, anything like that. They could be a new use of the skill. Quality of life increase in some of the ways that the skill is used or applied. And so, as you make these decisions when you're designing a tabletop RPG, you start to give the game a lot of its character and a lot of the stories and a lot of the aspects that will later be discovered by players and GMs, even though it's maybe not obvious just from reading it and seeing the way that the skills were put in there and maybe the proficiency, that was going to be the end result. A game designer has to be able to predict the effects that these decisions will have on the game.
When what's going to happen in terms of, are players who pick a particular skill generally going to feel like, oh man, I wish I picked something different? Or is one particular skill going to be the thing that is the must take?
Exactly. Like someone in chat said, perception in Pathfinder 2nd Edition should have been a skill. And the reason it shouldn't have been a skill, even though it is quite similar to one, and it's just sort of out there as its own thing, is because it would be such a must-take skill that it would basically be a skill tax, and those who did not take it, who refused to pay the tax, would just be kind of worse in a significant way. And certain things that were sort of defended against by perception would just those characters would just kind of get wrecked on that. So it kind of made perception more like a saving throw in a certain point of view in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. To be honest, in some games, perception is in even different places. There are multiple games like World of Darkness, but also just like Pillars of Eternity for the for a computer game that uses tabletop style mechanics. Have perception as an attribute.
Yeah. And I imagine it wasn't just its role as a defense, but also its role as the default means of determining initiative.
Well, I mean, that's part of it too. But even aside from that, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, where it wasn't initiative, perception was well known to be the thing that you were really asking for it if you didn't have it.
Yeah.
Because you would get destroyed by a surprise round.
So then would you consider that part of skills is often that the skill is optional in some way?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that and that rather than necessarily fully required or baked in.
Yeah, and so Dap, who was the one who was talking about perception being a skill, actually said that what they really meant is not that it should have been with the other skills, but that it's more like what we talked about at the beginning of the episode, like a pseudo skill that is a privileged skill that was not put in with the other skills that was increased in a different way.
Well, this is why I was trying to get a little bit more of a what is a skill even for the purpose of talking about this.
It's hard to define it. And honestly, some games define it in different ways. Even though most tabletop RPGs have a somewhat coherent usage of skill if the term skill is in there. But like World of Darkness, at least the 20th Anniversary Edition, skill is one of the three buckets of what we would normally call skills, but that are actually called abilities.
So are there any things that are in the category of a thing that a character can do that you would not consider to fall into the category of skill?
It depends on the tabletop RPG. Generally, in a tabletop RPG, things that you can do, and even certain things that are like reactive or defensive, like dodge, could be a skill. If depending on how you build the system, they might not be a skill.
Would you consider that a skill would always have some kind of probabilistic aspect to its success?
Generally, yes. If I would say that what we generally refer to as a skill, based on just a lot of RPGs having them, even if it doesn't scale, even if it's not selectable by you because your class gives it to you automatically, it would have some kind of probabilistic aspect. If it just was always on, it was just like, you gain resistance against fire damage. Is there a chance that you gain it? No, you just have it. That's probably not a skill under any RPG's definition of skill. That's probably some kind of feature or ability that
or then what would distinguish them from, say, like attributes / ability score / those types of things.
Those could be skills. In some games, they're the only ones.
In some games, they are, but they wouldn't be considered to be that in a game like Pathfinder, where you're not going to be like rolling them outright, but they instead are used as something to derive other numbers.
That's right. And so your game determines what is a skill. That's why when you started by being like, let's define what a skill is, and I was like, wait a minute, we have to talk about how you can choose what a skill is. Because we don't know yet. And the fact that you don't until you're creating your game is so wild compared to the other topics we've talked about on this stream. And it's something most people don't think about. Because when you see it and you're like, oh yeah, this all makes sense. Like any of these games you played, if you looked at them and what they did as a player, not as a game designer hat on, you just be like, yeah, that makes sense. I understand what I need to do. I understand the assignment. I'm going to build my character. But if you're in the void before the game was even created and you're the game designer, each of these decisions is carving out pieces of that void in unusual ways that are going to lead to emergent gameplay changes.
Yeah. So what are the different things that characters can do, and how are they sectioned off into buckets that always travel together versus things that are selectable?
Yeah, absolutely. So, essentially, our main point here is that next time you play a tabletop RPG, as a player or GM, maybe if you're not a game designer, take a look at the decisions that the games designers made about skills and their proficiency, whether they're called skills or not, and look at the things that were not made skills. See if they met what they were expecting to, what they're expecting to have based on the narrative with their skills. We gave some examples where games did not meet that, like where all the performs were separate in 3.0 and it didn't really help you, and there wasn't really a great reason for it. It was just a big drain on bards who wanted to be good at multiple musical instruments.
And another thing to consider too is, to what extent is it possible to achieve the same aims with different skills? Does your system generally say, okay, this is the only skill that can be used to swim. This is the only skill that can be used to fly. This is the only skill that can be used to do these particular things. And, perhaps it might have certain things that you can only do in one way, like this is the only way you swim. But say when you do other tasks, like say trying to do a skill challenge or such as, a chase scene or disarming a trap or something like that, maybe then it starts to bring in some different options for approach.
That's right. So Rohit in chat says that Rohit's understanding is OSR skills are not necessary, and in some sense a bad thing. If thievery is not a skill, everyone is a thief. I would say this. Even in early editions of D&D, there was a split among those early edition players among some people who did not like the thief class when it was added. It was not originally in the game. Because they didn't like that it had those thief skills, which meant that nobody else could use them now in the same way because the thief was supposed to have them. And so I would not say, I would not paint the OSR community in one brush as in that statement about what they want to include in the game in terms of skills. I would also say that sort of the simplified version where you do not have the thief class type situation with skills and you just use the 6 attributes in OSR, those are the skills. And so that sort of gameplay is more saying not that you shouldn't have any skills, although they were called skills, so it sort of is saying that, but instead that you should have only have a set of universal skills that every class has and a small set of them.
Yes.
So that people have only 6 options they can use. That causes them to be creative and the GM to have to adjudicate anything into one of those 6 buckets, and we know how good everyone is at those 6, and they have an equal chance to use them rather than having a class like in other OSR games or other old editions of D&D that defines how you can use the skill, or rather than having 50 different skills, and so then it's harder to say that you have it or how you could cover it. So that's what I would that's what I would say and what I would think about it. Obviously, there are people out there who know even more different kinds of OSR games than I do.
And generally, the more skills that it takes to cover the whole spectrum, the more specialized that characters are going to be versus being generalists.
That's right.
And the more specialized skills are, usually the more that a GM is going to let that skill.
So Dap in chat is asking, what is OSR? So that's a great question. OSR stands for 3 words, only 2 of which OSR can agree upon what they stand on. And the 2 they can agree on is old school. R, is that a revival where you are going to bring back almost exactly the way that the old games worked before with as few changes as possible to be legally distinct and cool settings and ideas and new tables that are being brought in? Or is it a renaissance where it's being reimagined using the old school vibes and philosophy to create something new that didn't exist before? Well, that is not agreed upon. some people who like one of them but not the other then say that the other one is not in fact OSR but is some other thing that is connected, and there are lots of disagreements within that community overall, and splits just like any other RPG community or really any fandom. It's a group of passionate tabletop RPG creators and players with some really fantastic games in there that you should check out. That is what it is. So, in that sense, there are a decent number of them that just say, hey, yeah, let's just use strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma as the only things you roll. In that case, I would say those are the skills of the game, because those are the only things that you roll. Your attacks are just that. You might have like a separate bonus because it's like you're the fighting class, so you roll strength at a +1 when you're fighting. But that's about it. So, as you think about this, think about how your favorite games sort of deliver the narrative to you by making these decisions about skills and proficiency. If you are a game designer who's watching this, and you've started to design your own game in your head, or maybe you've professionally published one, have you been thinking about these sort of aspects while you were making your decisions about skills? Did you just kind of put them in there for simulation purposes, or because you like the way the gameplay worked out, or the sort of story of including that skill in your world? Or were you deliberatively making these decisions in order to create the ripple effects you were looking for?
When you have your skills, are they arranged into certain buckets that are, say, these are things that are based on combat efficacy. These things are sort of high use and versatile versus these are more for flavor and not necessarily going to come up as often. Because you do have more freedom in what you create if you organize things into those kinds of buckets where you don't have to have them all pulling from the same resource.
That's right. So those are the main sort of ways that skills secretly influence your game, and sort of tricks that proficiency can have in the way that all encounters or even just any situations in the game can occur and change as the characters grow throughout the game, that I wanted to cover today. Mm-hmm. Did you have any other big ones, Linda?
No, I think we covered it.
All right, then we got through efficiently. All right, everybody, so I want to say again, well, I'll say for the first time, please like and subscribe. Even join if you want to join. But I will say again that titans.rollforcombat.com is a place that I think that you might want to check out, because it is my new Kickstarter that just launched today. If you are live in here, if you're not live, did not just launch today. It launched whenever this video was published. And it may not even exist anymore. Woo. But now it's time to vote for your favorite option from a new poll that we did not put up at the beginning of the episode. So I'm going to need to grab it now. Let's see what we've got here. So we've got the so vote in chat before you go for one of the following episodes. And we actually don't have a design diary style thing, so
Does anyone have any suggestions for a design diary?
Dap voted for 3, and we didn't even have
one
a
of that
3.
type. Does anyone have suggestions for that type of design diaries or player tools or GM tools?
All right, so here we go. Your choices are 1. Build a monster workshop. 2. Ask Arcane Mark Save My Game Q&A. 3. Dap voted before this existed and now it's stuck. 4. Arcane Mark plays. We'll vote for a game if this wins. And 5 other. Please specify. Eric Tezera still wants to build that chupacabra from before. And vote for 1. Build a monster workshop. Dap stands by the decision of Dap voted before this existed and now it's stuck. Mm-hmm. All right.
But if anybody gives an other idea, we can move it into 3. How do you get started with writing an adventure scenario?
I feel like we have that 5 somewhere, but maybe we do not. And even if we do, we can do something else that's a slightly different version of it. Oh, because I think we have one about adventure writing, but maybe not how do I get myself off the ground? I can't get started yet. All right, so 5 is get started writing an adventure. As opposed to the one we did before about writing an adventure.
Yeah.
Because sometimes they're different. Like, I've seen Linda have a thing where, like, getting started writing it can be harder,
than actually
writing it.
Absolutely.
So, we're going to give you tips for that if you vote for 5.
So, this would sort of be between the initial idea.
Oh, Teixeira. Okay, there you go. It's a Portuguese. I figured it might have a different way of pronouncing that X.
Teixeira.
That is why I hesitated slightly.
Thanks for telling us.
Thank you.
All
right.
So I feel like this would go from sort of like the coming up with your basic concept into making your kind of some of your initial outline and skeleton.
Also,
stuff.
part of things of ways to help motivate you and to increase your productivity and chances of actually writing it from the beginning. All right. So, we're going to do 5.
DAP has decided to change the vote from this only exists for DAP. I mean, to be fair, this is the kind of thing that would have gone in a 3.
Yes, we'll say 3 now equals 5. So, DAP was already picking 5 before it was cool.
Sorry, Eric.
Eric.
It will remain on the list.
Someday we will make a monster that might indeed be some kind of a chupacabra. But unfortunately, that day will not be November the 19th, because that is when we're going to talk about getting started writing your adventure. Just like, it's National Novel Writing Month. Getting started writing your novel is the hardest part, because, I don't know, I have some ideas of things that could be novels. I've never gotten started writing one. I probably shouldn't. But if I did, getting started writing it would be the hardest step. And with your adventure, the same thing. So we will do that next week on the 19th. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And I hope you enjoyed and that you picked up some interesting secrets about skills and proficiency. Take care. Have a good week. Stay safe out there. And we'll see you on Saturday. Finally, I know we missed a lot of Saturdays for whatever it was. I can't remember because it